It's so exciting to have New York Times bestselling author Jennifer Keishin Armstrong here in the store tonight, who writes for the Pop Culture Literate. And it's perfect to be in this very serious bookstore to talk about a TV series, because it was a serious show in so many ways. Sex and the City and its 4 single women changed the way we think, the way we live, the way we love. And Keishin Armstrong is here to discuss the show's legacy and its impact on television, feminism, fashion, and of course, sex. In her new book, Sex and the City and Us, she dives into the history of how the show got made, explores the reasons the critics have cast it aside in favor of dramas like The Wire and The Sopranos when discussing the golden age of television, and it features exclusive new interviews with the cast and writers, and this book brings us a critical, nostalgic, behind-the-scenes look at a TV series that changed the way women see themselves and see their closets. The Washington Post gave it a fantastic review and said, the writing is fizzy and funny, giving readers a retrospective as enjoyable as a $20 pink cocktail. I want to introduce Jennifer, who worked for a decade at Entertainment Weekly and has brought us 2 other important books about TV shows and their place in cultural history. The New York Times bestseller Seinfeldia, How the Show About Nothing Changed Everything, and a history of the Mary Tyler Moore Show, Mary and Lou and Rhoda and Ted. Her work has appeared in many places, including BBC Culture, the New York Times Book Review, Vice, New York Magazine, and Billboard. And I think if you ask her, she might still be able to tell you her favorite Debbie Gibson song.
Oh, yes.
All right, I'm going to hold her to that. So please welcome Jennifer Keishin Armstrong, author of Sex and the City and Us, How 4 Single Women Changed the Way We Think, Live, and Love. Thank you.
I love this dog. This dog's name is Cosmo, I believe. So that's so cute. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And you'll be lucky if I don't sing my favorite Debbie Gibson song. So I like to let my shows do most of the work for me. They are the brilliant people who brought us sort of all here and made us interested in it. So what we'll be doing tonight is I'll show a clip and then we'll talk about it and then show another clip and talk about it. And we'll have some time for question and answer at the end. So we're going to start with a pretty early one. And I always think it's interesting to look if you guys have watched it in order at all, or if you kind of remember like the beginning is it's a little different from the show it eventually becomes. So it's sort of fun to see these super early ones, and I wanted to talk a little bit about this one. So, like I said, this is very early on. It's a couple episodes in, and I wanted to talk about this partly because this is actually one of the times when it's so early in the show that they're actually pulling stuff from the column that it's based on, Sex and the City by Candace Bushnell, and the book that became a book, which was eventually adapted into this. So this is when they're still actually taking stuff from that, and she was the one who came up with the term modelizer, which they talk about in this episode. This is one where Miranda dates a guy who she finds out has invited her to a dinner party mainly just to placate all of his friends who have been haranguing him for dating unbelievably beautiful women. This is such a New York City thing, right? I don't know. Maybe there modelizers here in DC. No. Well, exactly. That's why it's funny. So this is one of those times when, it's much more like Candace Bushnell's work, where it's about this incredibly rarefied, tiny, tiny, tiny group of people, very, very privileged people in New York City. Like, can you imagine even, like, how is this a problem? Like, all the guys they're dating are too busy dating models instead. Like, that is a very specific subgroup of people. I just want to assure you all that even those of us living in New York City do not constantly run up against this particular problem. There are problems, but like this is an extreme version that probably only Candace Bushnell and a few of her friends, who, if you've seen her, she looked like a model and still does. She's older now, so she probably wouldn't be one. But this is one of those, like, the modelizers, And there were a couple others that, that they pulled directly from the column. The one where they go outside of the city to a baby shower. Do you remember that one? Which I actually love. That's when I started really relating to it. Like, we all have had to go to that baby shower with our single girlfriends. So this is a little extreme, but it does promote this kind of classic Sex and the City conversation that they're having here, right? Which is where they all kind of like bring up a topic and then discuss their own points of view about it. And one of the things I loved doing this book is that I actually talked to Candace Bushnell for the first part of it, because I was really interested in, like, was she really living this life? Is it possible for there to be a real Carrie Bradshaw? Because if there is one, she's it. And it turns out it's actually closer to reality than you might expect. Like I said, she just was part of a very elite group of friends. Like, she was running with people like Bret Easton Ellis, if you know his work. Big, those very, at that time, they were the Brat Pack of the literary world. And so she was going out to clubs every single night. She was dating wealthy men. There is a real Mr. Big who was like a publisher at Vogue. She was wearing those clothes, even though she was on a writer's salary. And it was because she had connections at Vogue. She knew who to borrow clothes from, by which I mean not her. She wasn't borrowing from people's closets. She was borrowing like from Dolce and Gabbana themselves, because she was a beautiful woman who was semi-famous in New York City, and they wanted her to wear their clothes. So there was an actual time when Candace Bushnell was living a life where she was sleeping on a friend's fold-out sofa bed, but going out wearing head-to-toe Dolce and Gabbana. So it is a little closer than you might think to reality. I know Carrie also has her own apartment, and it's kind of nice. But I was surprised to learn that she did live this life down to, dealing with men who were modelizers and wearing designer clothing while having no place to really live. So it's a weird life, but it is possible. So we're going to move on. I actually got choked up. Sorry. I didn't expect that. So I don't know if you figured out where this is, but this is the end of a very strange season that they shot before 9/11, and it aired after 9/11. So that's why they had that bit at the end. And this is also, does anybody remember which episode this is? This is when Big is moving to Napa. You don't go to Napa, you take a Napa. There's a lot of bad puns. So this is an episode where it's one of my favorites. I don't know about you guys, but this is, like, to me, top 3. This is it. And I love seeing the contrast even between that first clip we saw, and now they're making this beautiful high budget. She's wearing those shoes, those amazing shoes, great outfit. And it's so heartfelt now, instead of just kind of being a silly discussion about men who date models, And so this is really interesting because they shot a shortened season before they actually wrapped something like 2 weeks before 9/11 when they shot this season. And this was the final episode written for that season. So it ended up being kind of a tribute to New York, because the idea is that Big is leaving. And so they go on this beautiful date with a bunch of classic New York things. Like, they take, the carriage ride in the park, and they end up having to cut it short because Miranda has her baby. So they wrote this. It was called I Heart New York the whole time. In fact, they even argued about it, because Michael Patrick King, who ran the show, wrote this episode, called it that, and a bunch of the writers were like, oh, that's so cheesy. Do you really want to call it that? And he was like, yes, we love New York on the show. I Heart New York. She Hearts New York. We're calling it that. And he wrote that monologue, that whatever you want to call it, that voiceover, the whole thing. And they shot it, and then 9/11 happened. And they knew they weren't going to run until the January after 9/11. And it's weird for the show. They had a real hard time, because it's a show where New York is so important, and they're shooting on the streets of New York all the time. So they felt like ignoring 9/11 was weird. but it's also not such a serious show that they could easily, do something that had the gravity. So shows like The Daily Show, even Letterman, I don't know if you guys remember, but he came on and kind of gave a really heartfelt monologue. And that all made sense. Saturday Night Live had to come back, so they came back with the choir singing and, the tribute to the first responders. So everybody had kind of done that stuff. And they were in this really weird time of okay, it's going to be a couple of months afterwards. We're about New York, but no one is gee, I can't wait for the deep analysis of 9/11 on Sex and the City. And then once they looked at the entire season, they realized they had taken this more serious turn. There were a couple of almost creepy coincidences. One of them that we didn't see here is the fact that there's a scene where she has a snow globe and there's the Twin Towers in it. That's really weird. That's a weird thing to be on Sex and the City, and they had shot it before it happened. So it looked like it was a tribute, but it was actually just a coincidence. And then this bit at the end of this, which really sounds like it's making reference. It's about planes. It's about seasons change and so do cities. It's about being more serious and growing up. It's sort of wistful, but this was all written before that. So they got lucky in a very strange way. They did actually shoot. They would shoot her kind of I shouldn't say shoot. They would record her talking, doing her voiceovers in one go at the end of every shooting season. So they did that after 9/11. So they actually were telling me how it was just blocks away from 9/11. I moved there around the same time, so I remember this too. That everything was still smoking. It's a very strange mood all around where you're why am I even making this dumb show? They were all really questioning a lot, where once we started to recover and normalize, we got back to some regular stuff. But it was a really strange time for everybody, and people were going off and helping to volunteer and, help first responders and stuff, and then go run back and record some voiceover for Sex and the City. So this was just a really interesting coincidence that they were able to kind of incorporate it and do this. It turns out to look like a very tasteful tribute when in fact it was just the way it was. And the only things that they had to actually change before they went on the air were they had one shot that had the Twin Towers in it just by accident. They were able to, technology just blurted out, and that's the only change they ever made to the beginning credits, was that they originally had, when they show you all the different spots, one was the Twin Towers. It was actually where Sarah Jessica Parker's name was. They changed it to the Chrysler Building, and that was it. And then they didn't have to deal with 9/11 until the next season when they came back, which is when they did that kind of fun, kind of wistful episode that's about Fleet Week. Do you guys remember that? I love that one. And so that's when because things had normalized a little, they were able to kind of deal with it in a more reasonable fashion. And there were just a couple of, mentions. They talk about, remember when President Bush told us all we had to go shopping to be patriotic? They had a joke about that. Yeah, I know. They, of course, had to have a joke about that. I believe they had a manthrax pun. I'm sorry to tell you. And, they had that, one of my favorites, the one where they kind of flirt with sailors for an evening, and she then sort of has this falling out with the one that Carrie has the discussion with the guy that she's flirting with, because he says oh, I don't really like New York. And she says, I can't have anybody talking shit about my boyfriend. So that's sort of this all, it was just a really interesting turning point for the show, as well as the city, of course. Let's do another one. See, we needed a pick me up after the last one. I love this one. I'm sure we all remember it, right? Because this is the last season, and it was kind of when everybody was watching, and you would go to work on Monday morning and everyone would be talking about he's just not that into you, or later the Post-it breakup, which we don't need to mar this moment with that right now. But remember, this is when everybody was really into it. If you were going to be into it, this was the time. I love this for so many reasons. And a huge reason is the backstory of kind of how this came together. And also, I think, as we all know, how this continued, this became its own phenomenon, really. To me, this is like quintessential stuff that happens that's related to Sex and the City. This is how it goes. So the first part of this is that they actually hired, okay, so they had 2 gay men running the show. They had Darren Star created it, and then he eventually passed it on to Michael Patrick King, another gay man. And they had an entirely female staff of writers, which is awesome. Like, especially at that time, we still don't have that most shows, but really at that time, no one did this. And they just felt like, why wouldn't we have a bunch of women who are living in New York City and single? They really were all single and living in New York City. And they would literally go out at night, come back home, like write down what happened to them, take it to work the next day. And in fact, I talk a lot about this in the book, but they had a whole system where they had a van that would pick them up in New York City to take them into work. Work was in Queens, and I guess that was just like, no one could possibly imagine getting all the way to Queens alone by themselves, like from Manhattan at that time. So they had a van that picked them up from the transpo department at the show, and when they'd get in the van, they would all start talking about what happened to them, like who went on a date, what happened, and they'd kind of go over it, and they actually called it van talk. And then they would get to the studio, Silver Cup Studios, right over the bridge. And now Michael Patrick King, their boss, is there. And now they would have what they called host chat. And this was kind of it was more formal than van talk, but less formal than work. So host chat was like, the name of that was because it was like when you watch a morning show and the hosts will kind of banter a little bit, like Kelly and Ryan, if you watch that, they'll kind of just be like, oh, how was your weekend? Blah, blah, blah. That's what that was. This was supposed to be just like going over what they talked about in van talk, but with Michael. Then they started work. Okay, so they've already had 2 levels of group therapy by the time they've started work. And then they take everything that they kind of discussed from that and put it up on the whiteboard in the writer's room as possibilities for storylines. And then they'd start the real work of the day, which was basically usually fighting about things like, should Carrie end up with Big or Aiden or no one? So it's a bunch of women, one or 2 gay men at any given time. And around season 2, Michael Patrick King realized they wanted to start bringing in long-term boyfriends for the women. Steve was actually the first. I'm a big Steve fan myself. Love that Steve. And he thought, we're going to have to actually develop these men as characters, not like, if you guys remember the first and second season, there was a lot of this just kind of like freakish sex of the week. Like, you're just the funky spunk guy or whatever, you're just kind of like some weird sexual predilection, then you move on. So he wanted to start really developing these guys. And he thought, oh, we're going to need help. So we actually hired a straight male script consultant just to do that. This man did not even have to write scripts. He was paid to sit in a room with them. They would start the season in Los Angeles for a few weeks. It was like camp. And he was based in LA, Greg Behrendt. He would just come, hang out all day, and answer questions about men. There aren't any children around, are there? Because there's something, like, I actually couldn't believe I had to type this in my book, but there are some dirty things. And one of the things is that when Michael Patrick called Greg to offer him the job, he said, we need someone to come over and tell us what pussy tastes like. So I know, I was like, my mother's going to read this, but I have to put it in. But oh my God. So Greg Behrendt had the best job in the world. He was a stand-up comedian who had suddenly been pulled into a room full of women talking about sex all day long, who would just be like, so how does this work? That was it. And you might be able to imagine, given the process I just described to you, that a lot of what his job ended up being was to give actual advice to these women. And there was very little boundary between work and advice and real life and all this stuff. So one day during their technical lunch break, he was eating a cookie. I remember he said that specifically. And hanging out in the hallway with one of the women, and she starts telling the story. Yeah, I went on this date last night. We've been on a few dates, but he didn't want to come up. do you think that's bad? And he was like, yes. I mean, he's not into you. And she was like, but he said he has the early squash game or what, like some crazy thing. And what he actually said in the moment was something like, I don't care if he has to fly the space shuttle next morning. He's coming up if he's into you. So then another of the women kind of came by and heard this discussion, and it sort of ended up kind of morphing into the pithier version, which we see here. He said, well, he's just not that into you. And this woman was Liz Winstead, which is important later in the story, this other writer. So she's like, that's mind-blowing, kind of like what Miranda said. And then they went back to work in the writer's room. And when they got back to work, they were talking about something else completely. And everybody, like Liz and a couple of the other women who had heard this discussion, kept saying, like, we really just want to talk about this other thing that Greg just said because it's amazing. And so they started talking about it, and it became this. They were like, this has to go in. So it was actually the script was assigned to two other writers who worked together, Julie Rottenberg and Alyssa Zaritsky. And Liz Winstead from the original conversation actually came up to them during this, and she was like, you guys, do you want to write a book about this? Because this is huge. And they were like, no, whatever. She was like, well, what if I write a book? And they were like, fine, go away. We need to write the script. They didn't even call this episode He's Just Not That Into You. It's actually called Pick a Little, Talk a Little, which I have no idea even why. And so that's how little they thought of, like, obviously they were all into the discussion at the time, but they didn't think this was like headline news. It was only Liz who was like, I'm telling you, this is a thing. And she kept saying to people, this is Oprah. This is, and they're all like, whatever, Liz, shut up. We have scripts to write. That's our last season. We want to be done. And so finally she came to Greg and said, what if we wrote a book together? And it was He's Just Not That Into You. And they kind of settled on, if anybody's has anyone read it? I feel like I want to even say read, because it's sort of like a thing you get as a gift that's like a passive aggressive gift often. You're like, so why did what? Oh, thanks. So it's like you can kind of read it, kind of nod. It's really simple. And they really settled. He was like, I'm not an expert. I'm just like, I don't even understand why I got this first job. And now what is happening? And so he said, look, I will do this with you if we make it that you ask me questions as a straight single woman and I answer as a straight man. That's what I'm willing to do. I can't claim any expertise. We'll try to be funny and fun about it, but that's all I can do. So they put together a proposal and sent it out, and many people in publishing had the reaction that the others on the show did, which was, one person even said, this isn't even a magazine article in their rejection of this. I love a good publishing story here. So, and then finally there was one person, she was in her early 30s. She was actually the youngest and youngest publisher and one of the first female publishers. She had just started an imprint for actually my publisher, Simon & Schuster, and was looking for the big break. And she got this across her desk, and she said she was instantly like, I'm a huge Sex and the City fan. I remember this episode. This changed my life. Like, of course this should be a book. And she made it her lead, of her first batch of books she published. She told this is actually one of my favorite things she did. She told her staff, don't send it to Oprah. Send it to Oprah's assistants. I want it to get to the girls who are going to relate to it. Oprah's with Stedman. She's fine. She's not going to be like, you're right. He just isn't that into me. This isn't going to hit with her. It's going to hit with the younger women on her staff. And that's what they did. And they got on Oprah. And when they got on Oprah, the book started selling out everywhere. There were actual news stories about women fighting over the last copy. And you know how this works is once that starts, then more and more, there's more stories, there's more coverage. And it really became, if you remember, it was a huge national phenomenon. People still use it to the phrase to this day. It became a movie starring every person who was currently in movies at that. Do you remember? It's one of those where it's like Jennifer Garner and this person and that person and like anyone who would be in it was in it. But it's so crazy to me that this thing that a guy said giving somebody advice in a hallway while eating a cookie became an entire Hollywood movie with like every star possible. So, and a publishing sensation to this day. It sold crazy amounts to this day. It's still, you can still get it places. So that is the story of He's Just Not That Into You. I think we can do one or two more. Let's see. You guys, thank you. I worked so hard because she starts her next narration like right after that, and I worked really hard to get just a little bit of him in there because I thought like that scene. By the way, when I watch I've watched it several times now because I do this. Like, I hope we all appreciate how brilliant that scene is. Like the acting, like it's funny but it's serious. There's like so much going on, and to me, this is one of these classic Sex and the City. It's one of the ways that I think it's very underrated. Like to do something like that is hard. I'm not saying The Sopranos isn't also hard, but like we all, you shoot people, they're dead, whatever. Like you're broody, a mob boss, whatever. Like this is sophisticated stuff. And I love this scene. I loved it anyway before I even researched this book. Like I feel like when he said to me, "Oh, I have to tell you about the closet fight scene," I was like I knew what he meant immediately when he said that. Michael Patrick King. And this is actually the only scene that they had to reshoot all the way through a whole second time. And I love that it was for wardrobe reasons because they're talking about wardrobe in this. I also get very defensive of Carrie in this scene. Is anyone like team Carrie in this scene a little bit? Yeah, like Carrie can be terrible. We all know that, right? Like Carrie is actually awful in so many episodes. But this one, it's one of the times that I'm like, no, she's right here. Like there's that time when she is mad because Charlotte doesn't offer to give her $30,000 to buy the apartment later. She's mad at her for not like, what? But this, she's right. And Aiden's lovely, but she's right here. That is Roberto Cavalli. Like that's not, you can throw away your speed sticks, but like a Roberto Cavalli outfit is a big deal. So yeah, there's a lot of great stuff going on here. I feel like it's one of the classic moments here where we all knew her and Aiden were never going to make it, right? Like this is almost every episode that he's in, something like this happens where they fight over boundaries. So they weren't going to make it. And this is a classic example of that. But the other thing is that Patricia Field did the wardrobe for the show. Some of you may be familiar with her. She's a genius. Like, if you've seen the clothes on this show, you know that. I could talk all night just about her, but basically, like, I feel like what she did is she brought this kind of like punk rock, really cool, edgy aesthetic, in addition to, of course, the huge, very sort of artistic labels that she introduced to everyone. No one knew what Manola Blahnik was before the show, and now everyone in America and probably the world knows. Even something like Roberto Cavalli. I'm not like a huge fashion person, so like I didn't know how to identify Cavalli before the show. It turns out I think I like Cavalli's work. And like I actually learned that. I'm like, I don't like Dolce, but I like Cavalli. Like I learned this stuff because of the show. I still can't buy it, but that's cool. I have an appreciation. There's an actual artistic appreciation here. And I think a lot of us got this from that. And to me, what Patricia Field did with the fashion on the show is that she was dressing these women, not just high fashion, but she dressed them to express their characters. These women, Carrie Bradshaw was expressing herself through her wardrobe. She looked insane half the time. But that was the beauty of it, is like she was pushing the boundaries. And what I think is striking about this is that Patricia Field was dressing these women for each other, not for men. That's why the fact that Carrie looks bonkers half the time, it's not like when she's wearing that Heidi outfit, it sounds kind of sexy when I say it out loud now, but like, I don't know if you guys remember that she wears like a full on Heidi outfit with like braids and she put freckles on her. Like it's insane. And she's going to like have lunch with her friends, and this is what she wears. But she doesn't look, it's not about sex. It's not, despite Sex in the City, like they're not trying to be like sexy for men the way that if you watched, say, Melrose Place around the same time, they're all in their like, you know, very short business suits, that kind of thing. This is a whole different thing that she brought to television, and it's changed so much. So this does dovetail with this actual scene, because what Michael Patrick King said to me is that, you know, most of the time the fashion decisions were completely respected. The same way the actors said the script words as they were written, you did not question Patricia Field's insane fashion choices. But when they were about to shoot this scene, and that's why sometimes he didn't even like totally see wardrobe and approve it beforehand, he just trusted her. So he's ready to film this scene that's pretty important for character development. And these two show up to set, and you have to understand that on a set, like wardrobe and hair and makeup can take hours, especially on this set. In fact, many directors said to me, you never questioned how long it took hair and makeup and fashion on this show. Like you sat and you waited patiently because it was a huge part of the show. So hours go by, they're all ready. They come to the set, and Sarah Jessica is wearing a top hat and a shirt with like a frilly collar. And John Corbett is wearing a t-shirt that says chastity. And Michael Patrick King is like, huh, okay, so that feels distracting. I'm feeling distracted by this. He's like, honestly, I feel like whenever I look through the camera lens, what I see is top hat, frilly collar, chastity. Top hat, frilly collar, chastity. They're having a whole, you know, defining fight, and all I can think is top hat, frilly collar, chastity. But it takes so long for them to do hair and makeup and wardrobe. He shot it all the way through several times. And if anyone's ever seen TV production, it takes forever. It's like watching paint dry. It's so boring. They can take the joy out of every TV show you've ever seen if you watch it get shot. Because then they're like, now let's do this angle 17 times, you know. So they did the whole thing. And then he was like, nope, this is not, like when he watched it play back, he was like, we cannot do this. And so it was the only time that he made them change wardrobe, and it was the only time they shot it all the way through again. And I think I like where they landed with the wardrobe. I actually always remember this outfit on her. I always remember, I like a casual Carrie because she's still cool. Like she's just cleaning out her closet, and she's still wearing, like, she's got the like scarf on her that makes the outfit, makes the tube top work, and he's just got like a normal, you know, t-shirt on at this point. So there's your fun fact for that, in addition to it's just a really great scene. So we're gonna do one more, and then we'll do some Q&A. I know. Oh my goodness. Ooh. You guys know she ends up with him, right? It's okay. Who is in for watching my spinoff from Raoul's point of view? Right? Like, all of a sudden, in this one scene in the finale, there's so much concern about Raoul. I've barely ever heard this man's name. And so, Raoul's cold. We're going to tip Raoul. I actually always wondered a lot. I feel like that guy's seen a lot. I feel like he has very specific opinions about whether these two belong together, right? Who here is pro-big? Anti-big? Yeah, me too. I get so, and even watching this scene, I'm like mad again. Oh God, this like, oh, it's a joke. Good joke. Great one. That was a really good joke. Sorry. I get very upset. And this is the thing about the show, I think, and the finale is that I love that people still get upset about it to this day, because that means we were invested. And it's fine that it doesn't matter why, you know, how it ended one way or the other. It's a fictional show. In fact, my partner Jesse, who is here, sometimes he would hear me and my friends like talk about the show, and he's sometimes like, you guys know they're not real, right? Because like the way you start to talk, you know, it's like, and why? What do Big and Carrie even talk about now that they're married? And like they don't, because they're pretend. so it's going to be okay. But I love that about the show. I think that's what's so great about it. But I also, there's so many things to talk about in this scene. So this is obviously from the finale, and it looks gorgeous. This look on Carrie, right? Oh my God. Like she looks so good in this whole finale. Like the fashion was out of control completely. And you can probably imagine, like, I heard many stories about how every designer was sending everything they could, begging to be in this finale. In fact, I'm going to tell you one other thing, which is, does anybody remember the giant, like, silver gray, floofy, when she's in Paris and she waits for Petrovsky and he never shows up and she's just sitting in it? It's an incredible dress, and I love this story about it because it's perfect. It's like everything about fashion on the show. So they got that dress, and it was actually just sitting, because it's huge. It was just like sitting on a dress form in the middle of the whole fashion department, like just sitting in the middle, just calmly sitting there for weeks. And Patricia Field finally called Michael Patrick King down, and everybody, whenever anyone, I'm not going to be able to do it, but whenever anyone talks about Patricia Field talking, they all do this impression of her. She sounds like she's been smoking her whole life, which I believe is true, and that she's from the Bronx, which is also, she's like, this dress wants to be in the show. I love that, like that sentence. This dress wants to be in the show. And Michael Patrick King is like, we can't. Like, I love that occasionally he suddenly gets very, very practical about his character. He thinks his characters are real too. So he's like, Patricia, how would she pack that for Paris? That was his objection. How would she get that there? And that does make sense, right? It's like, we want her to have incredible fashion, and she's already bringing insane dresses, but like, what does this even go in? And she was like, I don't know, but it wants to be in the show. And that was it. And he like walked out, and then he turned around and came back in, and he was like, where should it go? And she was like, she felt really strongly that it should be in the scene it was in, because she felt like what it showed was how much effort she put into that date, right? Because if she was sitting around like in this, you'd be like, well, that sucks, but whatever. She could go do something else in Paris. But when she's sitting in that dress, she can barely even move, and she's stuck, and she's waiting, and he gets there, and she's still in the same spot waiting for him on that, when it's all like spread out on that bed. It's incredible. But this scene I love for a number of reasons. First of all, I keep wishing, because as I've now told you, I am personally anti-Big. So for me, I wish this was the final catharsis of Big and we were done. That's because, have we not all had a Big in our lives? This is why I get upset, because I'm like, the point of Big is he doesn't come to Paris to get you. The point of Big is he does this. That thing she says about, do you have some kind of radar? I feel like I've actually even said this before, of like, there's always that guy in your life that like, just when things are starting to settle down and whatever, who's suddenly like, hey, where are you going? What's going on? And you're like, you can't just do this. And he's done this 3 million times. That's the point of it, is he comes up in his limo with Raoul and says stuff. Says things like chicks several times. I feel like a chick. Anyway, but I love this scene also because they told me a beautiful story about it, which is, so this is Perry Street in the West Village in New York City, where Carrie's apartment is, even though she supposedly lives on the Upper East Side, the actual place. Has anyone ever visited? Yeah. Poor real people live there, and we all keep going to visit. But no, it's really true. I went there. I was there recently because of book stuff. We were shooting a promo for this, and the guy came out and was like yelling at people. He was like, no one named Carrie lives here. He did. He said all of his. And then he was nicer to us. Like, we weren't being obnoxious. So he was nicer to us. He was just like, can you please just do what you need to do and then go down the street? It's been 20 years of this. And I was like, I just felt so bad for him for a minute. So they're on her street. It's the finale. And, you know, you can probably imagine that, like, for practical reasons, what they do is they clump everything together that they have to film. So, like, they actually shot all of the New York stuff for the finale and then went to Paris. And then they clumped all together anything they had to do on her street on one day. And it happened to be the last night of shooting in New York City, period, for them when they did this scene. And it was the last scene. So you know, it looks beautiful. It's cold. I don't know if you guys could see because it's like, but they actually have, it's like breath. You can see their breath coming out. And they would often shoot in like spring and it'd be a little chillier than depicted on screen because they always said it was perpetual summer on Sex and the City, except this final season when it actually, they were at, like, they even acknowledge in this because she's got gloves. I mean, she's got her white gloves on, her like very fashionable white gloves. She's got her heavy coat. It's supposed to be cold because it's part of the vibe of the whole thing, you know, and you can see their breath. They're out there. And this was the last scene they shot in New York City. So the last words she even screamed were, I'm not, you know, I don't live here anymore. And she told me it, and she's better at telling it than I am because she's an actress. But like she said, like, and then I like, she did it for the last time and they were like, okay, Sarah Jessica Parker is wrapped. And she was like, oh my God, I don't live here anymore. And she was really sad and she started to cry. And the only thing, this is also just really cute trivia, but then she was cheered up because it turned out that her husband, Matthew Broderick, had been, she didn't know, but he like stepped out of the shadows and was like, I've been watching. They actually live a few blocks from where this is. It's sort of brave to me because like the bus tour comes through there all the time. And she's like, I have to time stuff so I'm not out there when the bus tour is there. She likes to be able to go around like a normal New Yorker, which God bless her for it. But like, you know, she pays the price sometimes. So she's like with the hat and the whole, you know, like she does not need that bus tour in her life. But they've always lived, just since they got married, they've always lived just a few blocks away from this. And so he was there with a couple of their friends watching the whole time. And then everybody got to go to like the White Horse Tavern, which is nearby. It's a historical place. If you guys don't know that, it's like, you know, all the usual suspects, all the like beat poets and everybody hung out there. And they actually, there's also a very cute little story that's not that relevant, but just cute in the book, which is that they finished, it was super late. They all ran over to the White Horse because they were like, we're going to go to the White Horse and celebrate. And they were closed because they were going to be like inspected, like health inspection early the next morning. So they were shut down to like get ready. And they basically said, how much will it take for you to stay open? And everybody in the cast and crew just like threw all the money they had on the table. And I guess because it was Sex in the City, there was enough cash around that they stayed open for them. And I don't know what happened with that health inspection, but they are still open. So something went on. I don't know if that was enough to maybe pay off the health inspectors too. Who knows? But this was actually their last thing that they shot in New York City. So it was sort of like an extra special moment for them, even though it's not the ending of the actual show. With that, I'm going to stop and see if you guys have any questions.
I have reason to believe that you do have an opinion, or at least some inside information about the Kim Cattrall and Sarah Jessica Parker feud.
I mean,
can you enlighten us?
I have thoughts. Let's go with that. I feel like what's wonderful about this in a really weird way. I mean, it sucks. If you guys have been following this, you know that there was a fairly public blow up on Instagram between Sarah Jessica Parker and Kim Cattrall a few months ago. And the one thing I can say is like, I had been sort of tracking this feud because I was really interested in, I don't like this like gossipy, like behind, I don't care who likes who or whatever. If they did their job, I don't care. But I'm interested when it starts to affect the work we see. And I'm interested also in kind of the media narrative of this. So I actually told Sarah when I interviewed her, because I was like, I have to ask you about this dumb feud thing. And she's very upset. Like, she's clearly upset about it, just in terms of like, she feels like she's tried her whole career to be a good person to work with. And she doesn't like this idea out there that she's some terrible person. And so it's upsetting to her. And, you know, when I asked her about it, I was like, listen, if I'm going to do anything with this book, I'm going to like track, like, when did this start and why? And I think I found like patient zero. I think I found the first mention. It was like second or third season. There started to be a lot of talk about how Kim Cattrall, it was a career making role for her. We all know this. And so it was sort of like unexpected that, you know, Carrie's supposed to be the lead. So there was like this idea out there. I have no idea if it's true that, you know, there was jealousy because Kim Cattrall was getting a bunch of attention. You know, Rolling Stone named her the sexiest woman of a certain age. That kind of thing was going on at that time. And so this is when this stuff started. She was also like not friends with the other women as much. She's 10 years older than the other women. And so this kind of persisted. And I do think that there's a little bit of sexism in kind of the media narrative of this. Like the women said to me over and over again is like, I hate that I keep picking on The Sopranos. I guess it started at the same time as on HBO. But like they all said like no one was saying, why isn't Jim Gandolfini hanging out with the other Sopranos in his spare time? What did he get them for Christmas? You know, these were the kind of questions. I'm not making this up. Like Sarah told me a story about how she would get questions like, what did you get Kim for Christmas? Why didn't you get her anything? Like, why didn't you hang out with her on the weekend or whatever? And she was like, I was doing laundry with my husband. Why would I want to hang out with a person I worked with? You know, they worked a lot. So basically my take on it is simply this, that like, if you worked with somebody 20 years ago, they were fine. You got through what you needed to get through. You didn't really feel like hanging out with them in your spare time. And then every day since then, people came up to you, strangers, and they were like, hey, do you want to work with her now? Why don't you want to work with her? Did you get her anything for Christmas? Did you hang out with her? What's happening? You would start to get annoyed whether you were initially annoyed or not. So I kind of feel like there's a weird combination of like probably real life stuff and a huge media narrative. And there's something about the show we talked about, right? People want it to be real. These women are playing friends. It's very upsetting for people to find out that they're not friends in real life, but like they're good at their jobs and we have to give them credit for that. And we also have to give Kim Cattrall, like she's in her 60s. You can kind of feel like part of her is just like, can I please just not do a sex scene right now? Like, I don't want to do a sex scene. I don't want to have to go to Abu Dhabi again and like throw condoms at men in an offensive scene. Like, I don't, you know, like I'm just leave me alone. So in that sense, I get it. And, you know, there's other factors involved in this. I know that Sarah's really disappointed, but maybe we may never know, but there's a chance, let's face it, that it's best that we don't get a Sex and the City 3. If any of us saw Sex and the City 2, we know there's a chance we should not have a Sex and the City 3. So maybe it's best. I have learned, you know, I write a lot about television in general, and I feel like in this age of reboots, some things are better left to lie. That was fun. Let's all move on. So that's sort of all of my thoughts about that. Did you have a question?
I did. Hi, thank you so much for being here. I read
you.
the review in the post and it was amazing. So I can't read your book. I have to admit I haven't read it yet. So if this
that's okay. I'll be really annoying then, and I'll be like, as I say in the book. I love to say things like
well,
that.
I don't want if this is, I'm gonna get it either way. But if this is something that's gonna ruin, you know, like I totally fine to not address this. But I watched the show over and over, starting in college, and you know, throughout the last long time. You know, as a coming of age sort of narrative, and obviously it makes sense that the women are sort of all archetypes, you know, and that many of us are a blend of some of them. But you spoke to this a little earlier, which was the unfolding of who Carrie's going to end up with. And I wondered, again, if this is like a spoiler for the book, totally understand, but if they had spoken at all to what that process looked like of the Big versus Aiden narrative, of her ending up alone narrative, and like, I'm sure it was a, you know, fought out type of thing.
For sure. And I love that. No, it's a great question. And I love it because it's also like, I talk a lot about the writers in this book because to me, first of all, I'm a writer, so it's no surprise that actually in all of my books, I end up very interested in the writers, but they have a lot of untold stories. Every set of writers I've ever talked to has always been like, no one ever asks us, because they're so focused on like Sarah Jessica Parker or whatever, and they have all the stories. They lived these. It was an actual rule that stuff had to be real if it was going to be like a sex or relationship plot on the show. It had to have happened to somebody that they knew on the show. So it was an intense process, as I was talking about. And a huge part of that, besides what I talked about, the van talk and all of that, what they did once they got into that writer's room is that they fought all day. So besides actually finally figuring out what's actually going to go in scripts, a huge part of their job was just to fight about stuff. And part of it was just like I was very passionate about my feelings about Big, they all had feelings about all of this. And they would just fight like crazy. And the idea was that all those fights, because those women are archetypes, what's great is if you had opposing forces in the writer's room, you'd get a bunch of different points of view out there. And then they would just pour those right into those brunch scenes where they basically, I always call them Socratic Sex and the City dialogues, where they just kind of say like, anal sex, what do we all think? Go. Pros and cons, do it. And so that was how that, you know, it went from just the basic like silly, I don't think it's silly, but you know, the sex stuff to more of this big relationship stuff. And so yeah, there's what I thought was sort of interesting is that I found that the longer writers had been on staff, the more pro Big they were, which I think is super interesting. So like the old school first and second and third season writers felt so connected to Big. And like, if you go back and watch the finale, it's not perfect, but like they set it up. They set up that like, this is the guy that's going to be the thing. And there's a whole bunch of them who felt like this was just one big romantic comedy where we kept them apart as long as we could. They belonged together. There were later writers who felt differently. Another one of my favorite fights was when they all fought about when she gets back together with Aiden. There was a big fight about that. There were newer writers who came out and they were like, we just went through the breakup. We're done. Like, it's obvious they don't belong together. Move on. So there were all kinds of fights about all of this stuff. There were some, like Berger, for instance. I love that they told me that they said we brought in Berger as a marked man. Like, he was always going down. It was just a matter of how. And then they figured out the Post-it thing. But, like, they always knew they were getting rid of him. And then Petrovsky was, like, an interesting one, too, where they kind of debated a lot of different ideas for this, like, essentially what ends up being the penultimate man, right? And it really depended a lot on who they ended up casting. When they ended up casting Baryshnikov, he, you know, there was that character really took shape. He's going to be older. He's going to be Russian. That, like, just the Russian part alone gives it a vibe, right? No one was like, gosh, I wish she ended up with Petrovsky. He was a cool guy. But yeah, there were a lot of debates to the end. And I personally felt like I just wish that she had come back to New York of her own volition because of her friends. Like, I felt like the central love story of that show was with her friends in New York City. And actually, Darren Star, who created the show originally and then left in the 4th season, and Candace Bushnell both said to me that, like, that was what they wished too. But when you let it go, you have to let it go. And that's why I'm also kind of careful about this, because as anti-Big as I am, I feel like Michael Patrick King made a beautiful show and made a beautiful finale. And he's the one who made it. He deserves to have his own vision. You know, we can debate the movies later and all of those relationships in them, but that is, so yes, there was a lot of debate about everything. And what I loved is that Michael Patrick always said, like, I remember Julie and Alyssa, the duo writers, saying to me that, like, when they were fighting about, they were like very anti bringing Aiden back, and he would come in, he would poke his head into their office sometimes and just be like, keep fighting, and then leave again. He's like, you're doing a good job, because he wanted that energy regardless of how it was going to turn out. So thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, Jennifer.
Hi.
I cannot wait to read the book. Thank you so much.
Yes.
And I think I want to call in sick the rest of the week and rewatch the entire series.
Yes.
My 2 quick questions. One, if you had to be stranded on an island with any of these girls, who would you pick? So basically,
that one's easy.
Okay. If you had to be stranded on an island with one of the 4 women, who would you choose? Basically, who do you like?
But that is fun because it could be different. It turns out, like, my answer, I think, is not different. But, like, I could see how I would like to hang out with Carrie, even though I always say I treat Carrie like a friend. Where, like, you know how you have friends who you're just like, oh, what is she doing? Like, what is this decision now? Who is she marrying? I guess I'll just have to get on board with Big. Fine. So I can see how she actually would be fun to hang out with, despite her flaws. But my initial reaction was, like, Miranda. And I think I used to be a Carrie. I think this is true of many women, especially who watched the show in its original time. I think I was a Carrie. And I write in the introduction about how the show affected my life, which is that not entirely because of the show. There were other reasons, but the show really helped me to end a relationship I was in and my engagement to my college sweetheart. And we had moved to New York City together, and I realized while I was watching the show, like, oh crap, there's a bunch of stuff I didn't do yet, and I could kind of do what these girls are doing. So I was really a Carrie then, because I was kind of a mess like her. And I think a lot of women start out as a Carrie and end up a Miranda when they're a grown woman. I hope most of us grow into Mirandas. So
I think I'm going to be Carrie forever. My second question is, and not in the scenes that you showed, but like I find when I rewatch the series, there's so much eating and drinking.
yes.
And I just, if you had any comments on that.
So, well, do you know what's crazy is that this cute online magazine called Life and Time actually did a whole article where they interviewed me, and it was about the food and drink on Sex and the City, because there is a ton. And I think that's a New York thing. That's my guess, is that it's because they're in New York and so centered on it and they have money. Right. So I think that's why, is because foodie culture. And I actually there's a whole section of the book where I actually talk about drinking culture and how this show helped to perpetuate that. Right before this, we were watching Friends. And they were at, the mythical New York City coffee shop where there's a giant sofa that's always open just for these like 6 white people to drink giant things of coffee. Isn't that convenient? But it was, they were much more, and I remember being in college then, and we'd all go to coffee shops because like Friends was cool or whatever, and we wanted to be like Ross or something. Whereas this show really made it like, all of a sudden it was like, oh, girls' night out equals pink drink, right? And there are, like, I quote some people who have written online and stuff about how like nobody's blaming it for alcoholism or anything, but like there is some stuff out there about how people started to feel like there's this weird pressure. And I think we all feel it now. I was just talking today about the like rosé all day kind of meme. It's like we keep going down this path. I was talking about like Hoda and Kathy Lee drinking at 11 a.m. every day on TV. And I'm not saying anything is anyone's fault, but like it does feel like there's a line from like Cosmos all the way down. And then what's hilarious is when I'm on book tour, every place I go, people are like, do you want this Cosmo and this cupcake? And I'm like, no. Like, Cosmos and cupcakes in particular just stuck to this thing like glue. And that's fine. And we all, there's things for every show and it's fun. I get that. But it's hilarious. And I do talk about this too, that like, I kind of have a whole chapter that's about the realism versus not of the show's lifestyle. And it's like, Sarah Jessica Parker is a size 0, you guys. That's an actual thing that she is. I've seen her. It's still true. I don't know what's happening there. She ate pasta in front of me. I don't know what's going on. But then on the show, they're just like, oh, and on some level, is it like a feminist issue? We could debate this all night. Like, part of me loves seeing her and Miranda just sitting there eating cupcakes and not making a thing out of it. I don't want a scene where they're like, isn't this terrible? That we're like, I don't want that either. But there is this weird thing where like they're extraordinarily thin, beautiful white women on the show who are just running around endlessly with the Cosmos and the cupcakes and the food and everything. And then she says something insane at one point, like, oh, my cardio, shopping is my cardio. And you're just like, I want to punch you in the face right now. That can't be true. So yeah, there's a real, I think that's all tied up in the lifestyle element in general. And I think that like my one defense of that is simply that what the show did do single-handedly and very fast was to make the single woman lifestyle go from, the example I use in the book is like, remember the Kathy cartoon? Where she was always like, oh, I ate too many brownies or whatever. Like that was based, and she had like long straight hair and she was really boring. It like overnight, this show flipped it from Kathy to this. And it's like not even just that people didn't feel sorry for single women anymore. All of a sudden, even married women wanted to be single women and do this stuff. So like there's a good side to it, but it's also a little bit like obnoxious. And then we can get into the whole like capitalistic kind of thing that's going on where it's like spending equals feminism, but baby steps. So there's good and bad of all of these things. Yes.
Hi, thank you.
Hi.
Again, oh my gosh, as someone who basically grew up with this show from, late college into, the next 6 years after that, it had a huge impact, I think, of women of a certain generation.
For sure.
And looking at now, we're getting to the 20-year anniversary of when the show started. That'll be next year.
This
Is
year.
it this year? I thought it started in 1999.
This came out for that.
Oh,
so,
okay. Well, there you go. How apropos. So 20 years later, looking back, 20 years later, what do you think has been the main way? I'm sure there's probably more than one, but if you had to choose one major way that this show had an impact on culture, American culture, or even internationally, because it certainly is known
huge
internationally. Would you say it's been more focused on sort of the idea of it's okay for women to embrace her sexuality? And so you see shows that almost inherited this Girls, which is more focused on 20-year-olds, 20-somethings. And it's so in your face about sex, and it's almost like vulgar. It's vulgar in a way that's not just that we're talking about sex, but we're talking about the ugly, dirty side of sex.
Absolutely.
Or is it more about women's liberation? And so it's okay to be single far into, even if you look at Samantha, the end of the first movie, she's celebrating her 50th birthday, and she just cut off this 5-year relationship.
To a hot man.
To a super hot man.
Who's much younger.
And it's funny because even at the end of the 6th season, she ends up with Big. In a way, I think there are still women who, even though the show is about women who are being single and liberated and all this other stuff, they all do end up in relationships. And Carrie gets the guy in the end.
Right.
Like the guy who was the unattainable guy, the one who you could never get until he suddenly turns around and goes, I want you.
Right.
And so it's kind of interesting, 20 years later, has it liberated us? Has it helped women to embrace their independent lives? Or has it, in a way, still also expected women can be liberated until the guy they really want turns around and says that they want them?
Absolutely. Of course, I don't know if I even would have written this book if I didn't believe a little bit that this did good. I talk a lot about the harm it did as well. It's a very strange show in that way that there's a lot going on all the time. There's super problematic elements, but like I said, I think the biggest thing, it actually is what I just said, is it just overnight. It went from being single is sad, you're a cat lady, whatever, to being single is drinking Cosmos every night and sleeping with whoever you want and talking freely about sex. And the talking about sex is huge. You cannot overstate what this did. It gave us a script for talking. No, we still don't do as much as these women did in terms of the way they talk about sex, but they pushed it way farther than that. The first season when they have I don't know if you guys remember this as well as I do because I just wrote a book about it, but they have the discussion about anal sex in the back of the cab. That was everyone was what just happened? That was the big bang of, female sexuality on television, because it wasn't just a sexy show or a show about sex. It was all from the women's perspective. And even the sex scenes, if you think about them, weren't sexy. They weren't porn. They weren't trying to be titillating. They were funny. They were embarrassing. They were character building. There's a lot of stuff. Kim Cattrall did a lot of the heavy lifting. One of my favorite things in the book is that they called her the Lucille Ball of the bedroom, which is genius because she did a lot of that. But her alone, she's the leader of the rebellion. Just the fact that Samantha exists in our imaginations now gives us something to, I don't want to say aspire to even, but it's she's so extreme that if we just go a little bit closer, I think the women talking about what they like and don't like is revolutionary. And I even wrote something for Vanity Fair online about Me Too and Sex and the City and how they don't show the negative side of sex that we're all talking about so much now. But what they did show us is how to talk about what we want and don't want. And if we started doing that more, that would help. I'm not saying it'll solve everything, but if we all knew what we wanted and didn't want when we were going into these situations, it would help a lot. So they did model that, and that's unbelievably huge. The fact that women go to brunch now and are we have to talk about sex. It's kind of obnoxious, but it's also kind of great. And the fact that you didn't even have to be like them. You didn't have to come to brunch and say, this specific thing happened to me last night. You could be hey, I watched that Sex and the City. What do you guys think about that issue. You know, like you could just talk about the show itself. So I think all of those things are really, really big. And I think we see it in a bunch of shows now. Like I always say Girls is a show about girls who grew up watching Sex and the City and are now figuring out what that means in real life, right? They're all like working out like, okay, what does this actually mean? And showing us the like negative side as well, I would say, to some extent, or weird side, whatever. And then there's a bunch of shows. There's Insecure, which I'm like, oh, it's so good. And it's coming back soon. But like Insecure really inherited a lot. And Issa Rae has talked about how influential this and Girlfriends was on her. No one talks about Girlfriends. It doesn't get the credit it deserves, but it was like the proto Sex in the City, and Living Single too. And, you know, she's talked about how much this influenced them. And what I think is cool, if you watch like an Insecure or even a Broad City, which doesn't look anything like Sex in the City, but it's like Sex in the City if you lived in Brooklyn and had no money, and had really weird lives. But they talk so openly about sex, and that's also about friendship. And then like Insecure, a lot of sex stuff, a lot of friendship stuff, and the way they're able to take it farther. So like, I'm again like, this is the weirdest book tour, because sometimes I'm like, I don't want to say certain things, but you know, there's a pegging episode of Broad City. They never did pegging. Go home and look it up if you don't know. If you don't know what I'm saying, you learned a new word. You can go home and look it up. There's a whole pegging episode of Broad City. There's like a bunch of stuff on Insecure that I think is so fascinating that they never would have been able to show and do. There's like Lawrence has a threesome that's very weird. I'm just gonna say that if you've seen it. There's a lot of stuff that they explore that I think is inspired by them and ends up being able to allow people to push it farther because we did Sex in the City. So that was a lot, but those are my thoughts. So one more? Can we do one more?
I was just gonna say, yeah.
Okay.
I think this should be the
One
last
more.
one.
And I'll be
And
around
it's
signing books. You can come up and talk to me afterwards.
I'm just fascinated, and along these lines, fascinated by the blurring of the lines between fact and fiction. Consider the subtitle of your book. You're saying how 4 single women. It's like,
Yes.
wait a minute, no, these
They're
are
not
TV
real.
characters. I mean, it just. So finish on those notes. You know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right. And by the way, you can't imagine the debates that go on about subtitles in general. And that was one. It was like, how can we get all this stuff in there? And that was actually a subject of debate when we talked about it. But we decided, like, I wanted to get the single part in there and the women part in there. And they did change a lot. So, you know, there is just so much. I think that's why we have the reaction I was talking about, which is this like very emotionally connected, as if they are real friends, debates about who she should end up with, what somebody should have done, whatever. And I think it's because, and it's a huge part of the book, I think it's because of those women who were telling their own real stories, those female writers who were telling their own real stories through it. I think the reason that people like me, I mean, like I said, my whole introduction is about how I related so much that I ended a huge relationship and, you know, went out and had this life essentially without the shoes. And, you know, that's the kind of, and there's stuff throughout the book, by the way, about other people who had small and big changes in their lives because of the show. You know, people who were inspired to become costume designers because of Patricia Field, people who I have a very cute rimming story in the book that's from real life. People were inspired to honestly, like, and they, God bless them, told me, tried like new sexual positions because this guy told me, you know, if it was good enough for Charlotte, it's good enough for me. You know, so there were so many, and that's why I think it's because these women were telling their real story. So it didn't matter that these women were wearing shoes we couldn't afford. It was that we related so much to the actual stories that it inspired people to do all kinds of things, and it makes people feel like they're really connected and they really knew them, and it allowed people to think about their lives in different ways. So I think it's really down to those women who were sharing their stories, and occasionally Greg Behrendt, who was giving them advice, I guess. Yeah, and to me, like a huge theme, and thank you for asking that question as my last one, because it's perfect, because to me, the biggest theme of this book was about the importance of women telling their own stories, and how women telling their own stories inspired more women to tell their own stories, inspired more women, and it just kept going. So that's what's really cool, and including my own in this book. So thank you for being here. I will be here to sign books if you want me to sign
Jennifer,
them.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.